The Ohio legislature Thursday, July 1st, passed a state budget containing a provision that appears to protect medical service employees and providers should they refuse to perform abortions or so-called sex change operations. But that's actually only half of the story. I'll give you the rest. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV, and the budget bill in Ohio was called HB 110, and it is over 1,000 tedious pages long. And believe me, I spent hours scrolling through that thing. It was not enjoyable. And as Raymond Wolf reports for LifeSite News, it contains a provision that protects, quote, healthcare providers from having to commit abortions, transgender surgeries, or other practices that violate their beliefs, end quote. Now, the pertinent clause of the bill actually reads thus, quote, notwithstanding any conflicting provision of the revised code, a medical practitioner, healthcare institution, or healthcare payer has the freedom to decline to perform, participate in, or pay for any healthcare service which violates the practitioner's, institution's, or payer's conscience as informed by the moral, ethical, or religious beliefs or principles held by the practitioner, institution, or payer. And Wolf adds, quote, exercise of the right of conscience is limited to conscience-based objections to a particular healthcare service, HB 110 continues. Okay, so far so good. And these clauses are of particular significance considering the multiple attacks on conscience and free association that we've seen a few states away in Colorado, where Jack Phillips, the owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop, has been attacked a second time for refusing to accept business, this time from a transgender so-called person who demanded that he make a birthday cake celebrating the so-called sex change.
The cake baker from Lakewood, who has been pursued for years from court to court for his refusal to create cakes he says violates his religious beliefs, he lost a new court case today. Once more, Masterpiece Cake Shop's Jack Phillips was sued after he turned down an order. This time around, it was for a cake for a gender transition celebration.
All right, so let's look at this first aspect of this new Ohio bill, HB 110, and see it in the context of Masterpiece Cake Shop and people demanding services. And we'll see why the Ohio move is significant for actually good and bad reasons. Okay, first, no one has a right to demand the services of another person, clearly, regardless of how much he or she wants to pay that person, and regardless of the so-called reasons for the demand. It might be tough for U.S. leftists who play high and mighty all the time to accept this point, but the U.S. Constitution now contains in it the 13th Amendment, which not only prohibits slavery, it prohibits involuntary servitude. And forcing someone who doesn't want to serve you to do precisely that is by definition involuntary servitude, regardless of the payment one might offer. If the service is coerced or done under threat of legal action, it's not voluntary, hence involuntary. So as a result, this new provision of the Ohio budget actually should be unnecessary. The problem is that states like Colorado infringe on the 13th Amendment with their anti-discrimination statutes that are all mixed up with this Masterpiece Cake Shop stuff. And actually, so does the U.S. government over and over again. I'll give you an example. The heart of the U.S. government problem lies in the 1946 Supreme Court ruling called Marsh v. Alabama. Now, that was an extremely important and disastrous case. It was a case in which a woman trespassed on a company campus to hand out religious documents. The company called the cops to have her removed after she would not leave. She claimed it was her right to hand out flyers, and no surprise, the FDR-dominated court ruled that the company property was the public square. In other words, it wasn't private property at all, it was public property, and the company couldn't exclude the woman. Well, this simply destroyed the concept of private property in the United States, and it turned it into government-defined public property. But public property is that on which tax money is spent, while private property is maintained and owned by private interests. After the Marsh ruling in 1946, the U.S. government then passed in 1964 the Civil Rights Act, which contained a provision in it that was disastrous, called the public accommodations portion. And that actually undercut the concept of civil rights itself, and it instituted federally enforced involuntary servitude, even as it continued to destroy the concept of private property. Well, how did it do so? It forced business owners to have to serve someone. Said force being the definition of involuntary. As I've noted for MRC-TV, peaceful property control and freedom of association are essential for civilization to function. Now, this includes the power to deny association. If a business owner wants to deny you services based on your lack of clothing or hygiene when you walk into his or her private establishment, shouldn't he or she be free to do so? And likewise, if a person has a house party, can the person not deny entry to people who aren't invited? And how about this? If you're on the dating market, can you not deny an unwanted offer to go to a dinner, regardless of how good the dinner could be?
I'm just not interested. But thank you for the compliment of coming over.
You're welcome. So do you like Cuban food?
Forcing people to accept those offers is, by definition, involuntary servitude. And as much as many contemporary Americans don't like to admit it, the act of discrimination, which is always mixed up in this emotionally, well, that's actually essential for life.
And if that wasn't clear enough, there's always the off that you have stamped on your forehead.
It's the process of distinguishing between two or more choices. And all humans and animals engage in this activity as a matter of survival. If one can't deny service to another, then one is an involuntary servant, and the matter of monetary compensation is irrelevant here. So this particular aspect of the Ohio bill shouldn't actually be necessary. But of course, given the scant number of politicians who understand the distinction between private property and public property, or even those people who have a clue about free association and the power of markets to reveal preferences that people can actually show in peace by voluntarily engaging with people they like, well, perhaps this move in Ohio will actually act as protection against people trying to force Christian doctors and nurses to engage in acts that run contrary to their beliefs. But there's a downside to this bill, which is that it also infringes on private contract between medical business owners and potential employees and the consumers who might approach them both. As much as one might not like to see doctors engaging in the practice of transitioning so-called people from one gender to another, and as much as that appears to breach the Hippocratic Oath, if the owner of a medical business wants to hire people who will agree to perform such so-called services, well, he or she has a right to do so, and the employees can accept or deny the offer. Just like the employee can demand certain concessions from the employer during the job negotiation process, so should the employer be able to accept or deny the employee's preferences. If the participants don't agree, they can turn away and form contracts with other people. Now, this does not apply to murder for hire, i.e., abortion. If one believes the U.S. Constitution is the so-called rule book of the nation, then the 14th Amendment mandates that any state with laws supposedly protecting people from violence must protect all people equally. It must protect equally all human beings. And that means fetuses, which are by definition human and being. So the Ohio bill is actually a mixed bag. It actually shouldn't be necessary, but few people acknowledge the Constitution that the state, local, and federal politicians swear to uphold. And of course, in this case, it infringes on private contract. Now, this is definitely a problem. And it reveals an even larger problem. Because as I mentioned, many of those politicians don't acknowledge the Constitution or private property. And one of them frequently appears on our radar screen in the form of Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, a supposed Republican who, in signing the bill, spouted a bunch of hot air about doctors being free to make choices. Keep that in mind. As Wolf reports, quote, "In the real world, most of those rights are not only recognized and exercised by medical professionals, but they're being accepted by other medical professionals," the governor said, according to Cleveland.com. "That is the way the world generally works. This is basically put in statute and codified." Well, that's interesting, because what he said essentially contradicts DeWine's own authoritarian COVID-19 lockdowns and mandates over the past year, because they were applied to businesses, including medical establishments and non-medical businesses. But of course, who would ever want to accuse DeWine of hypocrisy when he's busy posturing about medical freedom? Well, you know, given that 1,000-page monstrosity of a bill, and I'm telling you, it was not fun to read hundreds of pages of that bill. And I did, and it was not enjoyable. But given the 1,000-page monstrosity of that bill, Ohio seems to have a long way to go before its politicians can claim anything close to freedom for its residents. But this bill, this portion of the bill, is a start. Even if Mike DeWine doesn't seem to understand that he mocks himself by heralding its passage and claiming that he recognizes freedom of contract. Good stuff to learn and remember, spread to friends regardless of your home state. Because of course, the concept of freedom, private property, and free association, all of that is all entwined in the idea of being a peaceful neighbor to other people. Hey, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. And that goes for you too, Governor DeWine. I hope you're watching. Yeah. And do so voluntarily too. I wouldn't force you. And also, if you get the opportunity, please subscribe over at Rumble, where all our videos are housed. You can find us at MRCTV.org. And if you get the opportunity, go to shop.mrc.org, because you'll find great items there. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.